Okay, 11th and 12th grade, we're continuing in chapter 28 and we are on note 26. We're going to be talking about Joseph McCarthy, who gets a rewrite in history that is supported by just about anyone who is on the side of socialism and communism versus the capitalist system of the United States. So he actually gets branded as a bad guy in Hollywood in particular, but also in a lot of the media. He is branded as a very, very bad guy. But the truth was, he wasn't. He was actually correct in a lot of his suppositions. So we're starting on number 26. So turn to that and we will get started. Sorry, I hit the wrong thing. Of course I did. Okay. Also, somebody mentioned to me that one of the sections of notes wasn't online, and I made sure it got put online today, so it's there now. So it's there. It's from like 115 or 111 or something. Okay, so Senator Joseph P. McCarthy, he charged that the U.S. State Department had been infiltrated by a large number of communist spies. Now, before he came into the limelight, there was a house on Un-American, House on Un-American, oh my goodness, House on Action Committee. This was the House of Representatives was looking really at the whole United States and saying, where do we see communism having the largest impact? You know, people who are involved in the Communist Party and socialist meetings that are, you know, borderline communist, because communism is a form of socialism. And they noticed that there was a huge concentration of that kind of activity in Hollywood. And the House on Un-American Activities Committee went full force toward Hollywood and started demanding that people who were part of the Communist Party be recused or be let go, fired from their jobs. One of the people who was in charge of making sure that that communists weren't being hired in Hollywood was Ronald Reagan. He was the head of the union at the time, the SAG union, Screen Actors Guild union, and he would talk to actors, find out if they were involved with the communist activities. Now, the communist activities that we're talking about weren't just, do you belong to the Communist Party? People are looking at this activity as, are you part of the Communist Party and are you being used to spread state secrets? That was the problem. It wasn't the fact that people had a different political opinion. Although I think with HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, did start to embrace that idea that all communists, deserve not to work and to, be blacklisted or blackballed in Hollywood. At that point, you're starting to get into people's private and personal choices, which you should be able to make those choices for yourself. If you really want to believe in communism, go ahead. I'm not stopping you. Nobody else should be either, except for you can't force everybody else to be communist too. Get where that's going there? Okay. So that's really the problem that Hollywood had with HUAC. But as a result, there were a lot of people who were accused of being communists in Hollywood that weren't communists at all, or who just had a personal preference for communism, but they weren't trying to force everybody else to be communists and they were blacklisted or whatever. And that became a big problem. As a result, you have people who want to kind of lionize or make, they want to put down the people who tried to find those who are actually giving information to Russia. Okay, and so they look at this as a witch hunt. They look at the issue with HUAC in Hollywood as, this was completely and totally unnecessary, and it was just picking on people for no good reason. There was reasoning behind it, but HUAC overstepped its rights. Okay, they smashed other people's rights in order to try to figure out how badly Hollywood was infiltrated by communists. One of the people who actually gave up names about being part of the Communist Party was a man who knew people who were actually trying to get communist propaganda created in the United States and to push people into communism. They wanted communism, and that was Walt Disney. He was actually one of the people who stood up and said, "No, I'm gonna try and stamp out communism however I can, and I will be on the side of the government on this one." And he, to this day, there are some Hollywood stars who will say, "I will never go to Disneyland," because he turned in people who were communists. Like, okay, fine, do what you want. I don't have to go to your movie either. Okay, but here's the problem. Hollywood likes to ignore the fact that that was run by the House on Un-American Activities Committee, and they try to put it was Joseph McCarthy who did it. They call it McCarthyism. Everybody recognizes the term McCarthyism. And so people in Hollywood will talk about Joseph P. McCarthy going after people in Hollywood. And it's like, he wasn't the one who did that. That was the House on Un-American Activities Committee. Joseph P. McCarthy was a senator. He wasn't part of the House of Representatives. The reason they want to use McCarthy's name is because it's more famous, it's more popular, and they want him to be seen as the bad guy that everybody is trying to fight instead of telling the truth. Okay? So here's what actually happened with McCarthy. He charged that the U.S. State Department had been infiltrated by a large number of communist spies. Where did he get that idea? Oh yeah, let's think. Let's go back for a minute, shall we? Let's see. Oh, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, an engineer who leaked government documents to Russian spies. The fact that the Soviets suddenly had a nuclear bomb 4 years after the World War II was over. Chambers coming forward and saying, hey, there is a spy ring in the State Department. And Alger Hiss is a member. And he was so high up in government circles, he was actually one of the advisors to the president. This guy. Oh, yeah. Remember this? Espionage spy. The reason he came up with this idea that there were a lot of spies in the State Department was because it had been proven there were a lot of spies in the State Department. I said that really loud and kind of slurred, but he wasn't just coming up with something out of his own brain. He didn't pull it out of his hiney and say, oh, I'm going to just stand up against communism. No, there was proof. There were people who were actually being caught. And he's saying, let's do an investigation. That's what senators do. Let's do an investigation and find out who in the State Department, that's government, is actually a communist spy. That doesn't seem like that would be something that people would be against. They had already uncovered at least 4. Let's find out who else is in the State Department. That's our Foreign Relations Department. And let's see who's actually sharing state secrets with our enemies. Let's do this. And so when he made that first comment, he was actually being interviewed on a college campus by newspapers. And the press, as soon as he said there are large numbers of communist spies in the State Department, the press went, oh no, we are not going to talk about communism like it's a bad thing. We're not going to do that, because they're thinking HUAC, going after Hollywood, going after people who are in the media. So they say to him, how many exactly? He says, well, I don't know. That's why I'm calling for an investigation. See, we don't know. We know they're there, but we don't know how many are there. We don't know who they are. That's why we're doing the investigation. Well, you must have some idea how many there are. No, that's why I'm calling for an investigation. Oh, come on. You can't stand there and tell us that you think that there's spies in the State Department and then not give us a number. And they just kept hounding him and hounding him and hounding him. He's like, okay, fine. And he just said a random number, probably this many. And they went, okay. And they wrote that out. And every time they said, but it's nowhere near. It's not the number he gave us the first time. This is how the press works. Okay. This is why today, when the press pulls the same kind of garbage, and I hear people talk, or I watch them as they, their memes and everything. Remember when the press and the media were like journalists and they actually did the investigations before they printed their stories? No, I don't. I don't know when that was, because when I study history, I don't see that pattern at all. I don't see people looking for the truth. I see people having an agenda and writing their stories to fit that agenda. And it has been the way since the very, very beginning of press in the United States. Do they occasionally print a true story? Yup. And even a pig can find an acorn after a while. So let's talk about McCarthy. He had evidence of communist spy rings operating within the U.S. government. So who are going to be people who go after McCarthy? People who are involved in these spy rings. Huh. So 1952, he has evidence that this is going on. But the people who are on the side of the spy rings are going to be sending information to the media saying, this guy is just a bully. This guy's mean. And the press is like, this guy's a bully. He's just mean. And so they started to really go after McCarthy, and they're the ones that came up with the phrase McCarthyism. This is just a witch hunt. It's just McCarthyism. It's just a man making accusations and dragging people through names through the mud. And it's like, this guy was actually looking for communist spies that he had evidence of in the State Department. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, revealed that federal employees had been allowed into top secret facilities even after the FBI had tagged them as being communists. They had communist activities in their background. They were involved in communist groups, and they were still being allowed into top secret facilities. So J. Edgar Hoover's like, what's the point of my job then? If I'm finding out that these guys have a background in communist activity and you're still allowing them into top secret facilities where they could steal the secrets and pass them on, what's going on here? So early in 1954, McCarthy began an investigation of communist activity in the U.S. Army, okay? Because the Senate decided to allow television coverage of the Army McCarthy hearings, millions of Americans were able to watch the hearings. But every time they were bookended by talking heads on the TV saying, can you believe how mean McCarthy was? Can you believe how he just went after that guy? Can you believe, oh, that's terrible. So everything he did was framed with this idea of he was mean and he was a bully. Many Americans supported Senator McCarthy, but the liberals, the press, labor union leaders accused him of conducting a witch hunt. That's what they start calling it, a witch hunt. You write that note down. So it was during this time that one of America's great playwrights, Arthur Miller, there he is, got it on my shelf, he wrote this book called The Crucible. It's actually not a book, it's a play. He wrote the play called A Crucible. It's really interesting. It's fascinating, actually. It's about a group of teenage girls who have decided that they want to mess with the lives of the adults in their community. One girl is in love with a married man, and so she wants to get rid of his wife so she can marry him and live on his farm and live, a fairly wealthy life, better than what she's living now. The other girls are just, angry at adults because maybe they've been corrected and they don't like that. And so the girls all get together and they decide that they are going to lie about the adults in their community, and they're going to say that they can see demons and devils behind the adults, that the adults are actually possessed, and that in fact they are witches. Witch hunt? Witches? Get it? I'm going somewhere here. So they get together with some judges who come in who are going to judge the activities of the adults and discover whether or not they're actually witches. This is a real thing. So the judges come in and they recognize that a lot of these adults who are being accused of witchcraft have really nice pieces of property. So they accuse them of witchcraft and then have them killed. And then the judges end up taking that property for themselves. But the adults who are being herded before the judges. That is supposed to be, this is right here, is supposed to be a metaphor of the McCarthy hearings. This book is supposed to be a McCarthy hearings metaphor. Okay? So if you ever get a chance to watch the Crucible movie, it's actually really good. By the way, no witches were actually killed in Salem, because that's where this takes place. It takes place in Salem. No witches were killed. They weren't girls. The teenage girls weren't considered witches at all. People get that totally confused. I was actually in a classroom one time when somebody talked about the Salem witch trials, and one lady said, "Oh, those poor teenage girls just being, set on fire like that." I'm like, the teenage girls were the accusers. Nobody was set on fire. They were hung. One guy was pressed to death, for crying out loud. They just kept putting more and more weight on him until he crushed. Okay, so people get that story confused all the time. But there were no actual witches in Salem, despite the fact that now there are witches in Salem who say, "Oh, yes, we're here because, this is the energy from our earliest, time in the United States having witches. And, they were so persecuted back in the day." And it's like, it's all made up, guys. It was all a con. Okay. Let's see, where are you? Miller. Right there. Okay. So they repeatedly, and this is the press, the liberals, let's see, who all did we say? Liberals, the press, labor union leaders, repeatedly accused him of bullying until they had twisted America's perception of him, even inventing that new word, McCarthyism. So this is one of those guys that everybody looks at and says, "Oh, remember the days when Edward R. Murrow did the news and he just presented the news and he didn't give his opinion?" No, he gave his opinion all the time. Okay, so did Walter Cronkite, for crying out loud. People bring him up all the time too. And it's like, are you guys, what's going on? Do at least a little bit of research before you say this kind of ridiculous stuff. Okay, so McCarthy's accusations were all verified. All of them were verified to be true. But the attacks from news reporters hurt his image. And in December of 1954, the Senate denounced McCarthy. He ended up leaving the Senate and died a few days later from a stroke. Just brokenhearted, because everything he said was true, but the way he was presented was an absolute fabrication and a lie. All of his accusations, all of them, were verified to be true. This has actually happened previously in U.S. history when it came to the Scopes monkey trial. People throughout the United States thought that the man who was defending Scopes won. In fact, the man who was prosecuting Scopes won. But that's not what the news wanted people to think. Okay, while all of this is going on, Joseph Stalin died in March of 1953, and there was an immediate, brutal power struggle. Brutal. People were dying left and right, being killed, being assassinated. And so the final guy who comes out on top is going to have to be a guy who is incredibly brutal himself to be able to survive all the different assassination attempts. And very likely one of the people who's committing a lot of the assassinations as well. And that man was Nikita Khrushchev. So he eliminated, that's a fancy word to say, killed many of his rivals, and he was the new Russian strongman, Nikita Khrushchev. He came to power after Stalin was killed. Well, died. Wasn't killed. Under Khrushchev, the Soviets changed their aggressive tactics. Now remember, he killed a lot of the people who were in line for that powerful position. But once he got into position, he said, okay, we're going to change some of our tactics. Why? Because he wanted to win over the people of Asia and Africa. He wanted to seem friendly to them. So McCarthy is presented as a bully, and people don't believe him even though he's speaking truth. Khrushchev is a bully, and he kills people. But people are going to listen to him and believe him because he's going to act like he's nice. He's not going to tell the truth. He's a liar. So here he is sitting with Mao Zedong, who was the Chinese leader of China, and Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of North Vietnam. Well, yeah, North Vietnam. Okay, they pretended to support, this is Russia under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, to support peaceful coexistence. Communists can live in peace with, people they disagree with. That hadn't been proven by the Russians. That hadn't been proven by the Chinese, who were killing people by the millions. But he said that now communist world could live in peaceful coexistence with a non-communist world, and insisted that communists and capitalists could live together side by side. I don't know how that's possible because communists hate capitalists, period. I mean, there are man in the street interviews where one guy walks up to a girl, she's holding a Starbucks drink, and he's like, "Oh, so you're a big fan of capitalism?" Because, he's talking about politics. She's like, "I hate capitalism." He's like, "Well, you realize Starbucks is a capitalist company." And she throws it down on the ground. It's like, really? Okay. Do people not understand how capitalism works? The answer is no, they don't. Okay. But it's through capitalism that people go get jobs and get paid for the jobs that they do. Communist doesn't do that. Okay. In 1955, at the Geneva Summit, that was the first face-to-face meeting between a Soviet premier and a U.S. president since World War II, and that was during the time of FDR. Now we have a man who fought in World War II. They probably both did, honestly. He fought in World War II, Eisenhower, and he is going to meet face-to-face with the Russian Soviet leader. Now, he is not going to trust the Russian Soviet leader because he's not an idiot. So he's going to make sure that his spies, our spies from the United States, are going to make sure that he's not planning or plotting anything during this meeting. Okay? In 1958, Khrushchev threatened to send Russian troops into West Berlin, but he backed down because Eisenhower said, "I see what you're doing, and if you do that, the United States will come in and we will defend that city, and we will crush you." And so immediately Khrushchev said, never mind. So the guy who said, "We can live in peaceful coexistence," first thing he tries to do is try to take over a place, okay? He's not into peaceful coexistence. I'm not really sure how long your notes are, so I'm kind of pausing after each one. But you can always go back. Okay, let's look at the next one. President Eisenhower agreed to another summit in Paris in May of 1960, and again, making sure, using the spy network to make sure that what Russia is saying is what Russia is doing. As he and his advisors were journeying to Paris, an American spy plane called a U-2 was shot down over Russia. And the man who was piloting the plane was a man named Gary Powers. Okay, so the United States is like, nerds. Okay, one of our spy planes got captured. Okay, it went down right over Russia. So at that point, Eisenhower is like, okay, so how do we make this good? Now, keep in mind that both the Americans and the Russians had full-on spy networks. So it's not like it was a big shock to anybody, but Russia is going to use this time to go to the press and say, "Oh my goodness, the Americans are spying on us." Well, yeah, you're spying on us too. That's how you got the nuclear secrets in 4 years. Hello. You had spy rings working within our State Department. So the United States is just trying to protect itself. So Gary Powers gets shot down. He gets captured. And then he is going to be traded for a communist spy that was captured in the United States. See, it went both ways. But you never hear about the guy who was captured in the U.S. But they're going to split. They're going to do it in exchange on those two men. But in the meantime, Khrushchev is going to use that incident to say, "Look at that. The United States is spying on us. How dare they?" So he canceled the summit. He continued his Soviet arms buildup with that as the excuse. The United States is spying on us. Therefore, we're going to continue to build more and more war machines. However, when they gave up our spy, we gave up their spy. So it was going on both sides. A really great movie to watch based on this incident, by the way, is called Bridge of Spies. It's a Tom Hanks movie. Miss Dress and I got a chance to watch it actually in a theater with people who were alive during the incident, and they were all like talking back to the screen, but not in a jerky way. They were like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened. Oh yeah, that's Gary Powers. Gary Powers became later very famous as a KTLA newscopter traffic helicopter pilot. He became famous in Los Angeles. It's kind of funny. But yeah, we were in a room full of these people who had actually lived during this time. And Mr. S and I were just sitting there going, this is so cool. It was really cool to be around all these people who actually live that part of history as we're watching this historical film. And there's some funny parts in it. There's some really frustrating parts in it. Mr. S's favorite part is when Tom Hanks, who is so hungry because he's there to try to negotiate the spy exchange. That's why he's in Berlin. He goes to a hotel and he says, I want the American breakfast. And he goes, no, I want 4 American breakfasts. And they bring him all these breakfasts and big trays. And somebody tells him, we have to go right now. And he's like, oh, so he doesn't get to eat. Mr. Estes thought that was the funniest thing ever. So yeah, I love him. So I thought it was funny too. Okay, so in Egypt, while all this is going on, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian leader in 1955, he sponsored Arab terrorist raids across Israel's border. You're not really allowed to do that, okay? People do it all the time, but it's going to cause wars. If you send a bunch of terrorists to attack another group of people, the group of people you attacked is going to want to fight back. They're not just going to sit there and go, oh my goodness, we just got terrorized. Psh, oh well. Okay, no, you're starting a fight. So he sent terrorist raids across Israel's border, and in 1956, he seized the Suez Canal from Great Britain. Great Britain had permission by a previous Egyptian government to build the Suez Canal. It basically cut a channel at the very top of the Sinai Peninsula, and it allowed the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea to connect with a series of gates or locks. Okay, so the Great Britain, when it built that, it used its own money to build this because they realized that later on the shipping would cut a lot of money out of, shipping stuff from around Africa. This would be a great shortcut. So they paid for that, and then they paid for its upkeep, and they paid for its security. But Nasser said, I want you guys to stop letting people from Israel using this canal. And Great Britain said, no, the agreement was that everybody's allowed to use the canal, no matter where they're from in the world. And that's when he grabbed the canal and basically kicked the British out from using that canal. And then, because of the person he was, he closed the canal so nobody could use it. So Britain and France relied heavily on that canal for trade, and they joined with Israel in a war against Egypt. Israel was going to war against Egypt because Egypt was sponsoring terrorist activities in Israel. Britain and France were going to war against Egypt because they closed the Suez Canal. Okay. In October 1956, Israeli troops captured the whole Sinai Peninsula. The British and French regained the Suez Canal, and it happened in a matter of days. Israel is a teeny tiny little country, and Egypt's a great big country, and Israel kicked their butts. When the Soviet Union then threatened to come to the aid of Egypt, that's when the UN stepped in and said, okay. We can't have a war going on. We're the United Nations. We're supposed to talk things out. And Israel's like, well, you didn't want to talk things out when we had terrorist attacks on our soil. And Great Britain said you didn't want to talk things out when the Suez Canal was taken from us. But now that Israel has won the entire Sinai Peninsula, now all of a sudden we need to talk things through. Okay. So the UN arranged for the withdrawal of Israeli, French, and British armies, and then dispatched a peacekeeping force to keep them off of the land that they had just conquered. So obviously, even at this time, the UN was playing its hand, showing its hand that they were more on the side of the Soviet Union than they were on the free countries of the world. The Eisenhower Doctrine was adopted by Congress gave the president the power to use force if necessary against communist aggression in the Middle East. The U.S. then helped protect Lebanon from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union went after different places because they needed the extra income. Communism basically cannibalizes itself when it comes to the economy. They want money from everybody, they collect it, they redistribute that wealth, but there's no new wealth coming in unless they conquer another nation and take their wealth and then distribute it. So they just went after the nearest countries, and they went after countries that would be easy to overthrow. Maybe they had weak leadership, but they often had things like diamonds or oil. The Russians weren't stupid, but they went after Lebanon, and the United States went in and helped Lebanon to repel the Soviet Union from their country. Under President Eisenhower, free enterprise, also known as capitalism, which means you have the freedom to work to make money. You have the freedom to invent things to make money. You have the freedom to save money. You have the freedom to buy property and pass it on to your children. That is all part of free enterprise and capitalism. And under President Eisenhower, free enterprise capitalism thrived. States were linked for the first time with an interstate highway system, and Americans were encouraged to tour the country in automobiles. It's kind of fun. We have a lot of routes that you can take for road trips. Even still, you can type in like best road trips of the United States, and all of these routes will come up. They've been there for 50 years now, more than 50, 60 years now, 70 years now. And they're still really important routes, okay? So when we look at California, we have a really important route. We have a couple of them, actually. One is PCH1, which takes you up the coastline of the West Coast. And then another one is the 10, which we have right in our own backyard. The 10 actually goes all along the southern border of the United States and ends in Florida. So you could actually travel all the way across the U.S. on the 10. And then there is a route that goes from Chicago to, I believe it's Los Angeles, might be San Diego, the Route 66. That's, it's called the Mother Road. But there are a lot of these roads and routes that are famous for that people could take going all the way across and traveling all over the United States in their cars. Okay, the completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 opened up the Great Lakes region to ocean shipping. And that fostered a really close relationship between the United States and Canada because both countries were allowed to use it. In fact, every country is allowed to use it. With this kind of international canal, anybody's allowed to trade and get their goods from the Great Lakes region into the ocean. Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th states of the Union in 1959. Before this, they were territories. Now they had full statehood with all the rights that came as a result of statehood, all the responsibilities and rights. Okay. During this time, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1. This was the first space satellite, and they launched that in October of 1957. And as soon as they launched their first artificial satellite into space, and it was transmitting a radio signal through space, and they could track it around the globe, the United States went, oh, snap. The Russians got into space. We got to do that. Okay, we were behind. So American scientists scrambled to meet the challenge, and that began the space race between us and the USSR. People who were in school during this time, I wasn't born yet, not even close yet. Okay, but the people who were in school at this time said there was a dramatic change between the Friday they left before they found out Sputnik was a thing, and when they came back like the next week to school. They said we went from, the last hour of school, we did like arts and crafts, and we cut up, construction paper and paste and all this stuff. And then when Sputnik was shot into space, suddenly it was like, we're doing more math and science now for the end of the classroom. So they were like, it's kind of a bummer, but it was also really interesting because they got a lot more education, especially science and math. Okay, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA, was founded in 1958, and they launched America's first satellite, Explorer 1, in January of 1958. Obviously, there was a group working on Explorer 1 before the National Aeronautic and Space Administration was actually formed as that corporation. Okay, before that, it was a private corporation, still is, but it has government funding. Okay, the years after World War II brought greater opportunities for all ethnic groups. Minority peoples had served their country well during the war and always. By working and fighting for freedom, many Americans saw that the time had come to end racial prejudice. It still exists, but it's going to be a work in motion. It's going to be taking a long time, and it takes a lot of people the opportunity to actually relearn or, you know, how to behave in public. We've got people today who don't know how to treat people behind a counter, not even someone of a different race. They're just rude. So we need to constantly be teaching how to treat other individuals. Okay, we have someone from our school staff who's working at Starbucks right now, and she was asked, how's it going? She's like, people are incredibly rude. It's like, because people are in quarantine and they're frustrated about being quarantined, they feel like when they go out, they have the right to treat people like garbage everywhere they go. That doesn't make you feel any better, and it definitely ruins the day of the person you're being rude to. So don't do that. Now, the first group to achieve more opportunities were Black Americans. They wanted to guarantee a better life for themselves and their children under the legal protection of the Constitution. According to the Constitution, they should already be protected under the law, but there were individual states and individual cities and counties and towns that were doing everything they could not to fulfill the obligations of the Constitution. It was like they just wanted to forget the Constitution and do their own thing, which is really not allowed. So Black Americans were really like importantly showing, hey, we are protected too. You need to give us equal protection under the law. And say, I'm sorry, I'm covering up part of Rosa Parks there. That wasn't intentional. Okay, Jackie Robinson was famous as a Negro League ball player when he was signed by Branch Rickey to be the first Black player in the major leagues. He also starred in a movie about his own life, which is really unusual. You don't see that a whole lot. But he acted as himself in the movie to show what it was like going through breaking those color lines in baseball. It's kind of interesting. It was a really kind of cool movie. I know there's another movie about it called 42, but I've not watched it, so I can't recommend it one way or the other. But hey, look it up on IMDb and see if it's something you'd want to watch. Okay. Next, we have Jackie Robinson's grace under pressure helped him lead the way for many other Black athletes to become major league sports stars. That grace under pressure thing was really important. By the way, he was also a soldier during World War II. So he had a full all-American life and should have been treated with great respect. He wasn't by a lot of people. And he had to say, look, I'm just a person like everybody else, and I should be treated with respect just like everybody else should be. Okay, Jackie Robinson was elected into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962. Oh, forget that. Okay, singer Marian Anderson received many awards for her voice. She was a vocalist, including the prestigious Spring Iron Medal and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 1961, the American Institute of Public Opinion did a poll, and she was listed as one of the world's 10 most admired women. She was so talented that her church started a trust fund for her when she was only 6 years old so that she could pay to have professional vocal training. That is a marvel that she would be 6 years old and her church look at her and go, you've got something really different. You could be a professional singer at 6, and they paid for her professional training. That's an amazing church family. By 1939, she was recognized throughout Europe as one of the greatest opera singers of the age. Yes, she was an opera singer. So when she sings, if you listen to a recording of her, it's very highbrow. It's very well done, but it's not, she's not singing jazz. She's not singing R&B. She's singing opera. Very, very, what do you call it? Formal singing. That same year, however, that she won, the same year in 1939, that she's recognized as the greatest opera singer in Europe, that same year, officials in Washington, D.C., in our own United States of America, told her she was not allowed to sing at Constitution Hall because she was black. And it's like, what are we thinking? This is part of American history where we just have to look back and go, oh, people were idiots. Yep, they were. The group that denied her the privilege of singing at Constitution Hall were the Daughters of the American Revolution. They didn't want her to sing in Constitution Hall because she was black. One of those Daughters of the American Revolution was Eleanor Roosevelt herself. And she had to step away from the group and say, I disagree with what you're doing. And she arranged it with like the Department of the Interior, who usually takes care of like national parks and stuff. And they arranged for her to sing at the Lincoln Memorial instead. So the break of Eleanor Roosevelt with the Daughters of the American Revolution to promote instead Marian Anderson, that's one of the few things I look back on Eleanor Roosevelt and go, yep, she was absolutely right on that one. Good job. Most of the time I'm like, ugh, okay. But on Easter Sunday morning of 1939, she sang for 75,000 Americans who were outside, and it's probably cold out on Easter morning, who of all races, all walks of life, and she was singing at the Lincoln Memorial. But more than just 75,000 people got to hear her because every radio station that was in the area, and all the national radio stations for sure, were there to record her and play her music. So people got to listen to it in their homes as well. This is what the concert looked like. On the stage behind her are several dozen officials from the U.S. government who are standing up and saying, not letting her sing in Constitution Hall was absolutely wrong. We're here to support her. Okay, sometimes this one gets me tagged because it has, what do you call it? The newsreel on it. I'm not monetizing anyway, so I'm going to do it just hoping that it won't get bumped. But here we go. You can listen to Marian Anderson for real, for real. Seriously, go.
The nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her capital debut at the great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall fanned a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax. The singer was invited by Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, who attends with Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau. Spectators include Supreme Court Justice Black, New York Senator Robert Wagner, and a host of notables, here to listen to the voice acclaimed by many as the finest in a century. City
Okay, we're actually going to stop right there. I don't want to step on that note because it will just start playing again. Before we go, I want to read you a little note. I let Jenny Whitetrup know that we finished her book today, and she said thank you and congratulated everybody on finishing their year. So congratulations, and do me a favor, if you enjoyed the book, please let her know on Facebook that you thought what you thought of the book. Be kind. Let her know what you thought of it and what you got out of it. And I will talk to you guys a little bit later today because we're going to do 2 lectures per day until we are finished with this book. And I'll see you in a little bit.